So moving now on to inhabiting physical spaces with digital augmented on top of it. So not just taking play and making it physical through interactions, but actually transforming physical spaces through adding digital to those spaces. So this is a game called Google Ingress, which was about capturing locations on your device through physically being present in that space. So you'd have to go to these locations and you'd capture them by your device knowing that you were there. Really interesting project from Google, super interesting in lots of different ways. One was that the game was free, but in being free you gave up your pedestrian data, so that was passed on to Google so Google could see how people maybe moved through cities. And of course the interesting thing here is that the data that was used in this for what was effectively places of interest at various locations became the background for Pokemon Go. So Google Ingress, made by the same company that went on to make Pokemon Go, and so a lot of the Pokestops and those kind of things were from the original Google Ingress. Now what becomes interesting in Pokemon Go, although it was obviously a fad, it had been in development for a number of years in terms of augmented reality, and that one of the key things that they focused on afterwards was the amount of walking that it encouraged people to undertake. And I think that's something that maybe could be exploited further in the in extending the digital to the physical, so taking that physical space and extending it by the digital. Another company that did this really well was Mudlark, who created a game with Transport for London called Chrome-A-Roma. And in this game you were given a team by your start location. So your team was handed over to you depending on your start location, and that location was captured by your coloured team. And then as you used the underground, buses, Transport for London services, whichever station you used your Oyster card at would capture that for your team. So as you went from your home to your office, you would capture the station that you swiped in and swiped out with your Oyster card. What was really interesting about this project, and touches around some of the stuff that happened in Pokemon Go, is that it started to transform people's behaviours. And so what you would find is that people would end up getting off a stop later or a stop earlier and walking to their place of work just so they could capture the location for their team. So this was gamifying the commute, and in doing so it changed the behaviour of people. Same with Pokemon Go. People were walking much more than they used to. This was another example of something around that, augmenting the physical space. This was adding Pong game to crossing the road. So while you're waiting to cross, you can play a game of Pong with someone on the opposite side. I Love Bees was a big alternate reality game by a company called 42 Entertainment, who used GPS locations to encourage players to work together to make phone calls and to do sort of like a almost a game of telephone where they're passing on messages from one person to the other over a sequence of events. So this took the format of a physical game, but the starting point was digital, just a website. Another company that did some really interesting things were Volkswagen, who had a whole series of interactions with physical spaces under the banner of the fun theory. So what they did here was they added some digitalization to various spaces. So in this instance, they took the space of an escalator, and often would go up from train stations or up to platforms, and in monitoring this space, they noticed that everyone, although there was stairs, everyone would take the escalator to exit the train station or to go up to the platform. And so what they did was overnight they transformed the staircase into a playable piano. So with some very basic digital technology, and what they found that more people then ended up utilizing the stairs because it became a playful interaction, became something fun. So they would be encouraged to use the stairs. So there is something definitely around this idea of encouraging through a digital interaction or a gamification of spaces that can encourage and change behaviour. So that could be for social good. It could be to encourage people to get, to go on to public transport, to use stairs, to walk more, to adjust their behaviour according to that interaction. Now, of course, there's real simple ways that these things are being done, particularly in like sort of museums and exhibitions. And it's been done for a while. It's things like it's supplementing or augmenting that space, and so audio tours being a classic example in terms of allowing you to see a space but be given an additional piece of information through that digital recording, and so the need for the tour guide becomes obviously obsolete, and now it's supplemented by this device, which now can be location dependent. So depending on where you are, it can trigger particular things. And of course, using technology such as iBeacons, we can now go to exhibitions and we can use that information that tells us exactly where we are in that space, allows us to pull up additional information, not augmenting in terms of like adding to what we see in front of us, but giving us additional information based on where we are. So if we're seeing the statue, it will take us through to detailed information, to maybe high-res scans, things that allow us to interrogate a little bit more than just what would originally have been, the plaque on the object itself. So here we can find out a little bit more about the object. We can obviously listen to some commentary, we can see videos, we might be able to see it in its original situ, etc. So it's supplementing from the physical to the digital, so the other way around. There's been a few interesting ways of doing this as well, in terms of like adding screens to physical spaces and then using them to depict, either funny scenes. So in this instance, this was the BBC, a nature sort of experiment where they added what appeared to be a window to a bus stop, but in fact it was a video screen, and then they put in some additional animals and characters. So when you looked through what appeared to be a window, you would in fact be seeing a video with some other characters on there. So this was a form of augmented reality, but using a large format screen to do that. And in the Netherlands, they did a very similar thing where they had they utilised bus windows to depict parts of history as you looked out the window. So as you drove past a particular location, when you looked out the window, rather than seeing it in the year in the 21st century, you might see it in the 12th or 13th century, because the window would then be just showing you how that street would look in the past. So there's lots of ways of transforming the spaces through this digital interaction. Some of that is through objects as well that can trigger things. So 1.0 did a whole event called Cascade, where they utilized a bunch of different ways of people interacting with motion graphics, and so objects were triggering things. There's lots of projection mapping. So this was a company called Universal Everything, where they projection map into spaces to transform those spaces through fantastic sort of projection. And this can be done onto buildings, and again, just by that slight transformation or injection into a space through a very simple means of digitization, you get a playful reaction to a space. In this one, this was from an exhibition called Digital Sensations Decode, and this is a digital dandelion by a company called Senip. And in this instance, you would pick up a physical hairdryer, and you'd be able to use that to blow off the petals from the dandelion. There was a huge projection backlit projection that you could then blow these objects off. So you could have this, the wonderful moment of blowing a dandelion, but it's magnified into this larger space with a physical hairdryer that appears to blow these digital objects off, and provides a much more like immersive experience, which is really interesting. Bjork has done some fascinating things with the work that she's been undertaking. So this is a React table, which is a table where you put down physical objects, and then those physical objects set off particular sounds, and those physical objects can be connected together through these digital lines, and then the manipulations you make there depend on the different sounds that you make. And then what Bjork has done is taken this concept of the React table and actually started to look at new ways that you could create music through different types of digital interfaces, but also different types of physical interfaces. So looking at how you might create brand new musical instruments through this, and looking at different ways through, in particular, using digital tools to teach music and learning about the structures that are in music, that kind of stuff. And then there's been some work around that in terms of getting like robots. There's a whole record around music for robots, which is actually music played by robots. So much more complicated series of digital instructions in terms of music notation than a human could actually interpret or be capable of playing. And then the robots have actually played that. So we take this sort of mixture of almost the digitization of music notation, and then the physical robots playing that instrument. The interesting thing with a lot of this stuff is this idea of immersion and transforming spaces both physically and digitally goes back a lot further than we may realise, particularly sort of around the Victorian era. There was lots of things around sort of like immersive cinema, sort of immersive viewing platforms and panoramic views. They had this panoramic sort of 2-image stereoscopic viewer that would bring photographs to a little more like 3-dimensional. And so there's an interesting thing where immersion in a space is often, augmented through enhancing the view that we have. And so this is something to bear in mind when we're thinking about how we might engage some physical digital play, is how that level of immersion might work. Now, of course, there's VR, which is a very overpowering in terms of like your digital space, but of course you're still physically present, and the room may also provide additional elements that you can interact with the VR space. We've talked a bit about AR and how you can use a screen that you hold and look at to augment, so AR, augmented reality, to augment a space that you're in. And there's some key sort of pieces of technology related to that, like AR Kit, which is Apple's, Euphoria, Layer, and Blipper are all different types of like apps and development kits that allow you to supplement the space that you're in with additional objects, and that can be either through like almost QR codes that would show these objects, and rather than just triggering a link, we get a video of your space plus this additional object. But they can also be used by triggering with beacons, so location based, or triggered through particular images. So you could have it in this instance like that table is a trigger because it's been photographed and added into the system, and that enables us to drop this new board on top of it. The other area that's being looked at quite interesting is a thing called mixed reality. So this is the HoloLens from Microsoft. So this here is a device still that you wear, but rather than it covering your eyes completely, and rather than the screen being detached from you, the screen is very close to your eyes, and so what you see is this what Microsoft call a mixed reality. So you're able to look in a standard way, but by having this device on your head, what you get then in front of you is a mixed reality. So you can see the physical objects, you can also move around. It's quite interesting. Very limited actually in terms of viewability, because you can only see the field of vision is very, very small. So that's mixed reality. Another thing that's quite interesting, this is the Muse headset, which is a number of physical devices that are coming through that allow for mind control of digital objects. So that's an interesting way of, again, how the physical might go back into the digital. So rather than the physical being augmented by the digital, here we can use our physical elements, in this instance our mind, to control specific objects. So this is kind of like a super custom controller, which is good. There's lots of different devices, but I think the Muse is one of the more interesting. There's also, in terms of like other types of sort of mapping spaces, Brett Victor, who's working in the Human Advancement Research Community, which is a part of Y Combinator Lab. He's got this project called RealTech, which is taking has lots of cameras in the space and allows you to manipulate objects, physical things. Because of the cameras and the projections that are in the space, you don't need to wear any headsets or gears or have any custom controllers. The projection and the cameras handle the manipulation of digital data through the manipulation of a physical object in front of you. So that's something called RealTalk, which is a very interesting lab that's worth checking out, the Human Advancement Research Community, Y Combinator Lab. There's a few other artists that that I think worth looking at to sort of wrap this up. And there's an artist called Brendan Dawes who works a lot with data and looks at ways of transforming that data into something much more exciting and engaging, and that tends to be through projections, through physical objects, so transforming that data into maybe 3D printed objects, into things that you can physically handle, or that objects that are interacted through your physical presence in that space, or that they are physically demanding of your time because the size and scope of them, whether it be lots of screens that are being projected onto, whether it be lots of objects around you, or an immersive space. So again, similar actually in fact to some of Bjork's other work in terms of like digital spaces that become immersive through the fact that you're physically being bombarded with some digital visuals in this instance. Not necessarily that interactive, although some of it obviously is. And some of that, particularly in exhibitions and things like that, is where they take data of people entering or leaving, and that transforms some of the colours, the lights, the types of projection, the thing that's there. So it gets supplemented, the digital projection, the space gets transformed through knowing that certain people are there physically. So it uses that physical piece of data to push through into some sort of digital, and that might just be that the lights adjust according to the number of people. So he's worth checking out. And then there is another I think she's from Denmark, Teen Beach, who's an artist looking again at like interactive spaces. And again, I think what's really, really key with these things, and I think this is something to really think about and to consider, is this idea of playful interactions. So in all the things that we've touched on very briefly, which is a whole host of stuff for you to think about and consider, is that in all of these moments, they're not really games, they're much more like playful interactions. And that's either that you're augmenting the space through a digital tool, or that the physical space is the other way around, being added to and augmented by the digital tool itself. So you've got this opportunity to play with the space physically in terms of like augmenting one way or the other. But the other thing then is that tends to be much more information led and much more information heavy. Whereas if you look at a lot of the more interesting sort of game angles, they tend to be more about extending the digital space into more physical bodies. So engaging multiple players, but not just players that are going to be looking at the screen, but players who physically have to interact with each other. Now, whether that is in the first instance just by standing next to each other to do some dance moves, or as it kind of ramps up, it becomes more an engagement that your physical communication has to be paramount to the digital experience. And lots of the time that's through like couch co-op games and games that take advantage of people being physically present in the space. So very different to where sort of online games have gone, and lots of these tend to end up in exhibition spaces where people are coming together as a community to play, and so they are really encouraging people to interact with each other in much more in playful interactions that would have probably up until very recently really only existed in the playground until a certain age. Now those playful interactions can be pushed into, you know, a different demographic of people, into different types of social environments, different types of social interactions. So I think that's something seriously to think about, and something that hopefully this talk has given you a broad bunch of reference points that you can look at and go through.